Today we will explore a forgotten chapter in the history of agriculture, a period in which medieval peasants, without access to laboratories or chemical formulas, developed ingenious methods to protect their crops against pests, and many of these methods continue to work to this day. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is something deeply intriguing about the gardens of medieval Europe, something that for centuries remained hidden under layers of historical prejudice and a certain modern arrogance. When we look back at the centuries that stretched between the fall of the Roman Empire and the dawn of the Renaissance, we tend to see only darkness, ignorance, and backwardness. But in the cultivated fields of that time, in the gardens of monasteries, and in the beds around peasants' huts, a silent wisdom was in full activity. Men and women who never read a treatise on botany or studied entomology protected their harvests with an effectiveness that, in many cases, rivals the solutions offered by modern industry. And the question that arises is inevitable. What exactly did they know that we, surrounded by technology and scientific knowledge, seem to have forgotten? To understand this story, one must first imagine the setting. In medieval Europe, daily life revolved around two inescapable realities: fire and earth. Every house, from the humblest shack to the most imposing castle, kept a fireplace lit almost permanently. The fire warmed the rooms during the long European winters, cooked the food, and illuminated the nights. And, as a constant byproduct of this flame, a grey and apparently useless material accumulated: wood ash. In any other era, perhaps this residue would be discarded without a second thought, but the medieval peasant did not have the luxury of waste. Every available resource needed to find a function, and wood ash found several. What these farmers observed over generations of trial and error was that ash spread around plants created a kind of invisible barrier against one of the most voracious and persistent enemies of any garden: slugs and snails. To understand why this worked, it is necessary to understand the biology of these mollusks. Slugs and snails depend on a layer of mucus that coats their bodies. This viscous substance is not just the means by which they move, sliding over rough and irregular surfaces. It is, in fact, essential for their respiration and for maintaining the water balance of their organisms. Without this protective layer, these animals lose moisture quickly and enter a state of dehydration that can be fatal. Wood ash, by its nature, is an extremely dry and alkaline material. When a slug comes into contact with a ring of ash spread around a plant, the reaction is almost immediate. The alkalinity of the ash interferes directly with the mollusk's mucus layer, causing an accelerated loss of moisture. The animal, confronted with this hostile barrier, instinctively retreats. The ash worked in practice, like a small desert moat around each seedling, a miniature fortification built with nothing more than the residue from the previous night's hearth. And here one of the most elegant characteristics of this solution is revealed: it was essentially free. In an era when currency was scarce and trade limited, every family produced ash daily, which meant that everyone, from the feudal lord to the serf, had access to this form of protection. But there was yet another layer of meaning that the peasants themselves probably did not know. When they spread ash in their garden beds, they were not just creating a barrier against mollusks. They were, simultaneously, enriching the soil with essential nutrients. Wood ash is rich in potassium, calcium, and phosphorus, fundamental elements for the healthy development of plants. Without knowing it, those farmers were performing two simultaneous tasks: protecting their seedlings and fertilizing their crops. The importance of this discovery becomes even more evident when the numbers are considered. In humid climates, such as those that predominate in much of Western Europe, slugs and snails are responsible for a significant proportion of the destruction of young seedlings. On rainy nights, these mollusks emerge from their hiding places and can devastate entire beds in a matter of hours. Any gardener who has ever woken up to find their seedlings reduced to gnawed stumps knows this frustration well. And unlike the chemical metaldehyde pellets that modern industry offers, wood ash poses no risk to domestic animals, children, or the natural predators of slugs, such as toads, hedgehogs, and birds. It is a solution that protects without destroying, that defends without poisoning. The application, as one might imagine, was of a disarming simplicity. After a rain, when the soil was damp and the slugs most active, it was enough to spread a ring of ash a few centimeters wide around the most vulnerable plants. After a heavy watering, the material was reapplied. Nothing more. People who could neither read nor write had developed an efficient, sustainable agricultural defense system, absolutely free of harmful side effects. But ash, for all its effectiveness against invaders crawling on the ground, could do nothing against those arriving by air. To deal with flying insects and four-legged animals that invaded the gardens, medieval gardeners had to resort to a completely different strategy. And this strategy involved something that, at first glance, seems to belong more to the kitchen than to the battlefield: smell. Here opens one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of medieval horticulture. The discovery that odor could be used as a weapon of defense did not arise from any scholarly treatise. It arose from the patient observation of men and women who spent their entire lives working the land. And what they observed was that certain plants of the allium family, the botanical group that includes garlic, onions, and leeks, seem to exert a remarkable repellent effect on a surprising variety of pests. Modern science offers a detailed explanation for this phenomenon. Plants of the genus allium produce sulfur compounds as part of their natural metabolism. When their leaves are damaged, even slightly, whether by wind, rain, or contact with other organisms, these plants release a substance called allicin. Allicin is a volatile organosulfur compound, the same one responsible for the characteristic aroma of freshly cut garlic. And this compound, as it disperses in the air around the plant, creates a kind of invisible chemical cloud that deeply interferes with the ability of many insects to locate their food sources. Insects such as aphids and carrot flies navigate the world guided primarily by smell. Their sensory receptors are calibrated to detect the specific chemical compounds emitted by the plants on which they feed. When a garden is surrounded by a dense border of onions or garlic, the sulfur compounds released by these plants saturate the surrounding air and create olfactory interference that completely disorients these insects. They know there is food nearby. They can detect traces of the compounds they seek, but they cannot determine the exact direction. It is like trying to follow a specific aroma in the midst of a cacophony of intense and overlapping smells. Frustrated and unable to navigate, the insects eventually move away in search of easier-to-locate targets. Historical records suggest that this practice was known and used since at least the 9th century. In monastic manuscripts from this period, there are references to monks who planted onion borders specifically around their cabbage patches. Medieval monasteries were centers of agricultural knowledge, places where the systematic observation of nature was part of the daily routine. The monks noticed that caterpillar infestations were significantly lower in beds protected by allium borders. They did not possess microscopes, they did not know the chemistry of sulfur compounds, they did not even have the concept of entomology as a scientific discipline. But they had something equally valuable: centuries of careful observation and a tradition of recording what worked and what did not. And the principle extended far beyond insects. Herbivorous mammals such as deer and rabbits also navigate the world guided by smell. A deer has approximately 297 million olfactory receptors compared to about 5 million in humans. For these animals, the aroma of garlic represents an overwhelmingly intense sensory experience. A dense border of garlic around a garden worked as a practically insurmountable olfactory barrier. The beauty of this strategy lay not only in its effectiveness but in its dual functionality. The plants that served as a barrier against pests were, at the same time, valuable culinary ingredients. The onion that protected the cabbages would eventually end up in the pot itself. The garlic that scared away the deer would season the dinner stew. The defense of the garden and the supply of the kitchen were thus one and the same activity. Nothing was wasted, nothing existed without purpose. There was, in this approach, an instinctive circular economy that 20th century industrial agriculture would take decades to rediscover and attempt to replicate. But onions and garlic, as effective as they were against flying insects and herbivorous mammals, were not the only plants that medieval gardeners learned to use as weapons. There was another, of even more intense aroma and even more remarkable properties, which occupied a special place in the botanical arsenal of the Middle Ages. a plant whose name evokes Parisian absinthe and bohemian nights, but whose real history is much older and much more practical than any artistic legend suggests. This is wormwood, also known as artemisia, known scientifically as Artemisia absinthium. Wormwood is a perennial plant with silvery grey leaves, native to Europe and parts of Asia and North Africa. Its scientific name honors the Greek goddess Artemis, protector of the wild nature and the hunt. Long before lending its name to the liquor that would fascinate 19th-century artists and writers, this plant was a constant presence in medieval gardens, and not for recreational reasons. Middle Ages farmers discovered that wormwood possessed extraordinary repellent properties against a wide variety of insects. The method of use was direct and ingenious. Farmers harvested the dried leaves of the wormwood, placed them in boiling water, let the mixture infuse for some time, strained the resulting liquid, and applied it directly to their crops. The results were impressive. Flea beetles, aphids, and moths that used to lay their eggs on brassicas, the botanical group that includes kale, cabbage, and broccoli, simply refused to approach the treated plants. The explanation for this effectiveness lies in two chemical compounds present in wormwood leaves, absinthin and anabsinthin. These substances are intensely bitter, to the point of being among the bitterest compounds found in the plant kingdom. When applied to the surface of the leaves of other plants, these substances create a layer of flavor so repulsive that the vast majority of phytophagous insects strictly refuse to feed on anything covered by them. Bitterness works as a universal warning signal in the insect world. Something so unpleasant to the palate is probably toxic, and the instinct for self-preservation speaks louder than hunger. The discovery of this property did not come from any deliberate experimentation. It arose, like so many other medieval discoveries, from the attentive observation of the natural world. Farmers noticed that, in the vicinity of wild patches of wormwood, weeds were less abundant, and neighboring plants showed fewer signs of insect damage. Something in the vicinity of the wormwood kept pests away. From this observation, it was a relatively short step to experimentation. If the presence of the plant scared away insects, perhaps a concentrated extract could do the same when applied to other crops. And there was an additional advantage that made wormwood particularly valuable. This plant thrives in conditions that would be adverse for most other species. Poor, stony, dry soils, that neglected corner of the land where nothing else seemed willing to grow. It was exactly the type of environment where wormwood felt at home. Planting wormwood once meant having access to a renewable source of material for natural spraying for years on end. A plant that required little and offered much, an equation that any medieval farmer would recognize as valuable. But if wormwood was devastatingly effective against leaf-chewing insects, there was a whole category of pests for which it offered little protection. Soft-bodied insects that feed by sucking plant sap. Aphids, spider mites, whiteflies, these tiny and apparently fragile creatures that in large numbers can weaken and even kill entire plants. To deal with this type of threat, medieval gardeners found a solution in an unexpected place, in the process of washing clothes. Soapwort, known scientifically as Saponaria officinalis, is a perennial plant with pink flowers that grows wild in much of Europe. In the Middle Ages, it was widely used to wash delicate fabrics. When its leaves and stems were crushed and mixed with water, they produced a natural foam similar to soap, which was gentle enough to clean wools and silks without damaging them. Medieval laundresses knew this plant well and used it routinely in their work. The connection between washing clothes and pest control happened when someone, at some point lost in history, observed that the wastewater from the washing process with soapwort seemed to have a lethal effect on soft-bodied insects. The explanation lies in natural compounds called saponins, which are responsible for the plant's foaming ability. When diluted in water and applied to colonies of aphids, mites, or whiteflies, the saponins form a film that coats the bodies of these insects. This film blocks the spiracles, the tiny respiratory openings through which these organisms exchange gases with the environment. Deprived of oxygen, the insects die of suffocation within a matter of hours. It is important to note that this is exactly the same principle of action as the insecticidal soaps marketed today. Modern industry analyzed what medieval gardeners were already doing, scientifically validated the mechanism, and packaged the product in bottles with colorful labels. And there was an additional advantage: saponins degrade quickly when exposed to sunlight. A few hours after application, the active compound has already decomposed. There are no toxic residues accumulating on the leaves, and there is no risk of contamination of the harvested food. The treatment fulfills its function and then dissipates. The maintenance of this source of biological control was minimal. Soapwort, once planted, spreads vigorously. For the medieval farmer, this aggressiveness was a virtue. The more the plant spread, the more raw material was available. The history of soapwort illustrates a recurring dynamic in medieval pest control. Accidental discovery, born from the intersection of apparently unrelated daily activities. The laundresses were not trying to create an insecticide, they were simply washing clothes. But the observation that the residual liquid killed insects transformed a domestic byproduct into an agricultural tool. But the sprayed solutions of soapwort and wormwood, as effective as they were against insects on the leaves, did not solve the problem that repeated itself night after night in medieval gardens: the relentless onslaught of slugs. Wood ash offered a passive barrier, but there were times when a more aggressive approach was necessary. And it was here that medieval gardeners developed one of the most ingenious and brutally efficient traps in the entire history of agriculture. The method was of an almost comical simplicity. Gardeners buried clay pots up to the rim in the garden soil so that the opening was level with the surface of the ground. They then filled these containers with spoiled beer or a fermented fruit paste. And then they waited. The next morning, dozens of slugs floated drowned inside the trap. Night after night, the process was repeated, and night after night, the slug population decreased. The science behind this trap is as elegant as it is simple. The fermentation process produces volatile compounds, especially those derived from yeast activity, which exert an irresistible attraction on slugs and snails. These mollusks can detect the aroma of fermentation from surprising distances. Attracted by the smell, the slugs abandon whatever plant they are consuming and head straight for the source of the aroma. Upon reaching the edge of the container, they enter it without hesitation. But the smooth, damp walls of the clay pot prevent any attempt to climb out. The mollusk falls into the fermented liquid and drowns. The trap works as an invitation that the slug cannot resist and from which it cannot escape. The logistics of this solution were perfectly adapted to medieval reality. Craft breweries were common throughout Middle Ages Europe, and batches of beer that did not reach the desired quality standard, or that simply soured before being consumed, were frequent occurrences. This spoiled beer, which could not be sold or consumed, thus found a second life as an agricultural defense weapon. Once again, the principle of total utilization manifested itself. Nothing was thrown away, everything found a use. The numbers associated with this technique are impressive. A single buried container could capture 50 or more slugs in a single night during periods of peak activity, and this same technique is employed by gardeners all over the world to this day. Centuries of technological progress and a medieval trap made with spoiled beer and a clay pot remains one of the most effective slug control methods available. But capturing slugs was in its essence a defensive strategy. It eliminated invaders as they appeared, but it did not stop them from trying. Medieval nobles, with their more abundant resources and grander ambitions, sought something more aggressive, something that not only warded off pests but punished them for daring to approach, and the substance they chose for this task was at that time as valuable as silver: pepper. In the context of medieval Europe, spices imported from the East were extreme luxury items. Pepper, in particular, was used not only as a condiment but as a currency, as a dowry, and as a symbol of social status. The fact that some nobles were willing to grind this precious ingredient and spread it over their cabbages says a lot about the severity of the pest problem and the value they placed on their gardens. The active principle of pepper, capsaicin, is the compound responsible for the burning sensation. This substance activates pain receptors in the tissues with which it comes into contact, and the effect is universal among organisms equipped with nerve receptors. Nobles ground peppers in water, let the mixture infuse, and applied it to their plants. A single contact with a treated leaf was enough for a squirrel or rabbit to associate that food with an experience of intense pain. Pain is an efficient teacher. Naturally imported pepper was out of reach for the vast majority of the population. A handful of pepper cost more than a common peasant's weekly wage, but, as in so many other cases, popular creativity found an alternative. Mustard seeds, which grew abundantly throughout Europe and cost absolutely nothing, contain irritant compounds chemically similar to capsaicin. Not as potent, but effective enough to produce the same type of reaction in herbivorous animals. The peasant who could not afford imported pepper could harvest mustard seeds by the roadside and obtain a comparable result. Necessity, as always, was the mother of invention. The application was economical in every sense. A small amount of pepper powder or ground mustard, diluted in water, was enough to treat a considerable area. After rain, the application needed to be renewed, as the water washed the compound from the leaves. But the replacement cost was minimal, especially for those who used mustard seeds grown on their own land. It was a solution that scaled perfectly. It worked equally well for a small home garden and for the extensive gardens of a manorial estate. But the burn of capsaicin and the irritation of mustard were just two of many weapons in the medieval arsenal. Some problems required more subtle, more strategic approaches that did not attack the pest directly, but dismantled the entire system that sustained it. And it is here that the story turns to one of the most underestimated and misunderstood pests in the gardening world: ants. At first glance, ants seem harmless in a garden, but this impression is deeply misleading. Many species of ants maintain a symbiotic relationship with aphids. They protect them from predators, transport them to the tenderest parts of the plants, and in exchange collect the honeydew that the aphids excrete. As long as there are ants in a garden, any effort to control aphids will be only partially effective, as the ants protect their herds against ladybugs and other natural predators. Medieval gardeners, through centuries of observation, understood this dynamic, and the solution they found was a plant with golden flowers called tansy, known scientifically as Tanacetum vulgar. This perennial plant, with fern-like cut leaves and inflorescences in the shape of small yellow buttons, produces chemical compounds called thujone and camphor. These compounds interfere directly with the pheromone trails that ants use to navigate. Ants orient themselves primarily by smell, following chemical trails left by their companions. When these trails are interrupted or masked by the volatile compounds of the tansy, the ants completely lose their navigation ability. They reach the edge of an area planted with tansy and simply stop, disoriented, unable to proceed. The ripple effect of this interruption is profound. Without the ants to protect them, the aphids are exposed to their natural predators. Ladybugs and lacewings, which were previously constantly chased away by the ants, can finally do their job. In a matter of weeks, the aphid population collapses without the gardener needing to apply a single spray. It is a perfect example of indirect biological control. Instead of attacking the pest directly, the support system that allows it to thrive is removed. Tansy's reputation as a plant of agricultural value was so established that Charlemagne himself, the Frankish emperor who ruled a vast portion of Europe between the 8th and 9th centuries, included it in the list of plants that should be cultivated on all imperial estates. The document containing this determination, known as the Capitulare de Villis, was compiled around the year 812 AD and constitutes one of the most detailed records of Carolingian agricultural practices. In it, Charlemagne lists about 90 plants that he considered essential for the proper functioning of a rural estate, and tansy figures among them. When an emperor includes a specific plant in an administrative decree regulating the management of his lands, it is safe to say that this plant had proven its value over generations of practical use. Medieval beekeepers also recognized the value of tansy. Ants frequently invaded hives in search of the honey stored by the bees, causing disturbance and damage. Planting tansy around the hives created an exclusion zone that the ants could not cross, protecting the bees and their honey production without the need for direct intervention from the beekeeper. It was a passive, permanent, and self-managed solution that required only the initial planting and no subsequent maintenance. But tansy, for all its effectiveness against ants and its positive consequences on aphid control, dealt only with what happened on the surface of the soil and above it. There were underground problems that required equally underground solutions. And to face the invaders operating beneath the earth, medieval gardeners turned their attention to one of the most common and folklore-laden trees in all of Europe, the elderberry. The elderberry, genus Sambucus, is a tree or shrub that grows spontaneously throughout temperate Europe. In the Middle Ages, it was surrounded by superstitions and legends, many of which attributed protective powers to it. But behind the mysticism, there was a very concrete practical observation. Medieval gardeners noticed that rodents, especially rats and moles, systematically avoided the vicinity of elderberry trees. Moles that happily dug tunnels across an entire field abruptly changed direction when approaching the roots of an elderberry. Rats that infested barns and pantries were rarely found in structures near these trees. The explanation for this phenomenon lies in a compound present in elderberry leaves called sambunigrin. When this substance decomposes, it releases traces of hydrogen cyanide. In humans, the amounts involved are insignificant and do not pose a risk. But rodents have extraordinarily sensitive respiratory systems, proportional to their small body size. For them, even minute amounts of hydrogen cyanide cause significant respiratory discomfort. It is enough to make any area near an elderberry unpleasant enough that they prefer to seek food and shelter elsewhere. The method of use was characteristically practical. Farmers boiled a generous handful of elderberry leaves in water for about 30 minutes, let the liquid cool, and then spread it around the edges of their garden beds. The resulting odor kept burrowing rodents away for days. But medieval creativity did not stop there. Some gardeners went a step further and introduced fresh elderberry branches directly into the mole tunnels. Confronted with that irritating aroma in their own space, the moles would abandon those tunnels entirely or waste energy digging new paths around the olfactory obstacle. Either way, the roots of the carrots and other vegetables remained protected, and the elderberry, just like wood ash and soapwort, was essentially free. It grew wild throughout Europe. A short walk and a little boiling water were enough to transform leaves gathered by the roadside into an effective rodent repellent. But not all the problems of a medieval garden came from below the ground. On the surface, there was another enemy that any gardener of the time knew well: cats. In the Middle Ages, semi-domesticated cats roamed freely through villages and rural estates. They were tolerated and even appreciated for their ability to control rats, but they had the frustrating habit of using newly sown beds as places to bury their waste, digging up seeds and damaging seedlings in the process. It was a problem that, it is worth noting, remains absolutely identical 800 years later. Cats have not changed at all. And to deal with cats, beetles, and a series of other surface invaders, medieval gardeners turned to one of the strangest and most pungent herbs in their entire arsenal: rue, known scientifically as Ruta gravulens. The specific name, gravulens, comes from Latin and literally means strong-smelling, a description that, as direct as it is, does not do justice to the actual experience. The aroma of rue is intense, penetrating, and for most animals deeply unpleasant. Cats in particular demonstrate an almost visceral aversion to rue. Planted along the edges of a bed, rue creates a zone that cats refuse to cross. Medieval gardeners discovered this empirically and began using it as a living olfactory fence around their seedbeds. Beetles also avoid plants growing in the vicinity of rue. The plant's volatile oils contain rutin and other compounds that irritate the cuticle of insects upon contact. Beetles preferred to fly 3 gardens away rather than land on plants near rue. Monastic records specifically mention the planting of rue alongside rose bushes. Medieval rose bushes were particularly vulnerable to beetles, and the presence of rue nearby dramatically reduced the damage without anyone having to spend hours picking insects manually. The monks, with their schedules divided between prayers, studies, and manual labor, appreciated any solution that saved time and effort. But rue came with an important warning that medieval gardeners learned, possibly in the most painful way possible. The oils present in rue leaves react with ultraviolet radiation from sunlight and can cause severe burns on human skin, a condition known today as phytophotodermatite. Contact with the plant on sunny days could result in painful blisters and prolonged irritation, Medieval farmers learned to harvest rue only on cloudy days or after sunset, a precaution that demonstrates a level of practical knowledge and attention to detail that belies any stereotype of medieval ignorance. The Romans centuries before already knew and used rue, calling it the herb of grace, and spreading its cultivation throughout the territory of their vast empire. This means that this plant has accumulated more than 2 millennia of documented use as a pest repellent. And so, with rue protecting the garden surface against cats and beetles, and with elderberry keeping rodents away from the subsoil, the medieval defense system began to acquire a remarkably complete structure. But there was one last piece to this puzzle, a practice that involved no plant, no extract, no infusion, just hard work, a shovel, and the knowledge of when to use it. Every autumn after the first frost hit the fields, medieval farmers took their tools and began to dig deeply into the soil of their garden beds. This was not a superficial weeding or a light preparation of the ground. It was a deep excavation, 2 shovel depths deep, intended to reach the layers of the soil where the real problems were hiding. Because beneath the apparently calm surface of any autumn garden bed, a legion of pests is preparing for spring. Japanese beetle larvae, cutworms, cucumber beetle larvae. All these organisms spend the cold months buried in the soil, in a state of dormancy, waiting for temperatures to rise to emerge, complete their life cycle, and begin feeding on the newly sprouted plants. It is a sleeping army, invisible but devastatingly efficient when it awakens. The deep autumn excavation interrupts this cycle with a simple brutality. By turning the soil to great depths, the farmer brings these hibernating larvae to the surface. And once exposed, 2 things happen. First, the nightly frost reaches them. Without the insulating protection of the deep layers of earth, the larvae are exposed to temperatures they were not designed to withstand and die of cold. Second, opportunistic birds quickly identify these exposed larvae as an easy meal and take care of eliminating what the frost did not reach. The timing of this intervention was crucial, and medieval farmers were fully aware of it. The digging had to happen after the first frost, when the larvae had already buried themselves to hibernate, but before the ground froze completely, which would make digging physically impossible. This relatively narrow window of time required attention and knowledge of local weather conditions, the kind of practical wisdom that was passed from father to son, from neighbor to neighbor over generations. The results of this practice were significant. A single deep excavation in the autumn could reduce the soil pest population the following spring by significant proportions. It was a preventive measure in the purest sense of the term. Instead of reacting to pests after the damage was already done, the farmer attacked the problem before it manifested. Instead of chasing insects throughout the growing season, he eliminated them during their period of maximum vulnerability. It was strategy, not combat, a surgical offensive that neutralized the enemy while it slept. And the cost, once again, was 0, except for physical effort. No products to buy, no special equipment to acquire. Just the same shovel the farmer used for all other field work, and the knowledge of when and how to employ it. It was the ultimate expression of medieval economy applied to agriculture. Significant result with minimum investment. When observing the set of these techniques, a coherent system outlines itself. The ash protected against mollusks and fertilized the soil. The garlic borders confused flying insects and scared away mammals. Wormwood made the leaves untouchable for beetles and caterpillars. Soapwort eliminated aphids with natural foam. Beer traps captured slugs by the dozens. Capsaicin taught mammals to look for food elsewhere. Tansy dismantled the aphid protection system. Elderberry warded off rodents. Rue kept cats and beetles at a distance. And the autumn excavation eliminated larvae before they could cause damage in the spring. Each of these techniques individually addressed a specific aspect of the pest problem. Together, they formed an integrated defense system that covered practically all the threats a medieval European garden could face. And most impressively, they all shared the same fundamental characteristics. They were based on local and free materials, did not involve dangerous toxic substances, did not harm the surrounding ecosystem, did not require specialized knowledge, and did not depend on any kind of commercial or industrial infrastructure. This system was not invented by a single brilliant mind in a single moment of inspiration. It was built over centuries by thousands of anonymous people who observed the world around them with attention, experimented with available resources, and shared the results with their communities. It was a collective, gradual, and deeply organic process, rooted in the practical necessity of survival and an instinctive respect for natural cycles. Modern science, with all its instruments and methodologies, has validated the vast majority of these practices. The sulfur compounds in garlic, the saponins in soapwort, the thujone in tansy, the absinthin in wormwood, the capsaicin in pepper, the sambunigrin in elderberry. All these compounds have been isolated, analyzed, and confirmed as effective repellent or insecticidal agents. What medieval peasants discovered empirically, without microscopes, without chromatographs, without any of the apparatus of modern analytical chemistry, science has confirmed in laboratories equipped with cutting-edge technology. The conclusion is both humbling and inspiring. Those people knew more than we give them credit for. And perhaps the most relevant lesson of this whole story lies not in the chemical compounds or specific techniques. It lies in the mindset that produced them, a mindset of observation, of experimentation, of total utilization of available resources, of harmony with natural processes. A mindset that saw the garden not as a battlefield to be dominated with brute force, but as an ecosystem to be understood and managed with intelligence. In the gardens of medieval Europe, amidst the ash of the hearths and the pungent aroma of garlic, in the yellow flowers of tansy and the soft foam of soapwort, lies an agricultural heritage that has crossed centuries and remains as valid today as it was in the time of Charlemagne. A heritage that reminds us that sometimes the most effective solutions are not the most expensive, the most complex, or the most technologically advanced. They are the simplest, the oldest, the most intimately connected with the earth and the cycles of nature. Medieval gardeners did not have degrees. They did not publish scientific articles. They did not register patents. But they left something more lasting, a body of practical knowledge, tested by generations, that continues to work perfectly more than 600 years later. If that is not wisdom, it is hard to imagine what would be. And so we come to the end of this journey through medieval gardens, but perhaps it is only the beginning of yours, because the knowledge we have just explored does not belong to the past. It is available here and now, waiting to be applied in your own garden bed, in your own vegetable patch, in your own piece of land. If this narrative has awakened in you the curiosity to know more, to explore other stories forgotten by modernity, to discover what else our ancestors knew that we have not yet learned, then subscribe to this channel. Every subscription, every like, every comment you leave is like that ash spread around a fragile seedling. It may seem like something small, but it is exactly what allows us to keep growing. Leave in the comments which of these medieval techniques you already knew or which you intend to try. Your participation is what keeps this space alive and feeds new documentary narratives like this one. Until next time.